In the winter of 1828, the people of Naples whispered of a puppeteer whose strings moved without hands, and whose daughter's shadow danced long after she died. They called him Lorenzo Bellini, a craftsman of wonders, a father devoted, and a man condemned by the church for what he claimed to have seen beneath the stage. No records mention his death, no grave bears his name. Yet for nearly 2 centuries, in certain archives of southern Italy, a set of sealed documents has remained, papers marked with a warning in Latin, De motu cordis mortuae. Tonight, we unseal them. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the Macabre Record channel, where we unearth the forbidden tales that history tried to bury. And tell me, in the comments below, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Now, let us begin. In the spring of 1901, a historian named Giovanni Santori catalogued a collection of abandoned documents in the underground archives of the Basilica di San Domenico Maggiore in Naples. Among the dust and rot of centuries, he found a bundle wrapped in aged parchment, bound by a red silk ribbon, and sealed with the faded insignia of the old Neapolitan diocese. The words pressed into the wax were barely legible, but Santori would later record them carefully in his notes. For ecclesiastical eyes only. Inside were 17 loose sheets, browned and brittle. The ink had bled into the paper like dried veins. The pages contained fragments, court transcriptions, personal letters, and at least one report written in the hand of a local inspector whose name had been blackened out. The oldest dated to 1828, the newest to 1829, and all referenced the same man, Lorenzo Bellini, theatrical artisan, resident of Via del Porto. According to Santori's surviving letter to the Ministry of Culture, the contents of the file were unsuitable for public study, due to theological inconsistencies and improbable mechanical claims. Yet he wrote one line that remains in the archive catalogue to this day. It is not the story of a man, but of something that learned to move when the man did not. The documents were resealed the following year, and forgotten for nearly another century. No official publication has ever referenced them. Until now. In the early decades of the 19th century, Naples was a city poised between superstition and science. The plague years had faded into memory, but the shadow of poverty and faith still clung to the narrow streets like a scent of old incense and salt. Gaslight had not yet reached most of the southern quarters, and when evening fell, only the soft glow of oil lamps or the lanterns of fishermen illuminated the maze of alleys that spilled toward the harbor. It was a city alive with sound, church bells, distant opera, the cry of vendors, and beneath it all, the wooden clatter of puppet theaters that drew both the devout and the damned. Puppet theater in Naples was more than entertainment. It was ritual. The marionettes were saints and sinners alike, their wooden faces painted with devotion or deceit, their movements mimicking humanity with unsettling precision. The poor found in them a reflection of their own suffering. The wealthy saw art, but the clergy, at least the older priests, viewed them with caution. They said the human soul was easily fooled by things that moved without life. Among these small stages, none drew as loyal a following as the performances held in a dim courtyard off Via del Porto, where a sign carved from cherry wood read simply, Teatro Bellini di Marionette. The place was barely larger than a chapel, its walls damp with salt air, yet every performance left whispers in its wake. The puppet's eyes seemed to follow spectators long after the curtain fell, and the strings shimmered as if touched by light even in shadow. No one could explain how the figures moved with such human grace, or how they seemed to breathe when the air in the theatre stood still. It was there that Lorenzo Bellini, a craftsman descended from generations of carpenters, built his legend. His hands were calloused but steady, his eyes pale and quiet. He rarely spoke beyond what was necessary for business, but those who knew him said he treated his marionettes not as toys, but as students. One neighbor recalled hearing him speak softly to them as he worked late into the night, his voice steady, coaxing, patient, like a father teaching a child to walk. He lived above the theatre with his only daughter, Isabella, whose delicate health kept her indoors for much of the year. When she was seen, she walked slowly, gracefully, as though guided by unseen rhythm. The neighbours pitied her. Some said she was mute, others that she was shy. Only her father knew that her silence had purpose, and that her eyes, unblinking and fixed upon the puppets, were not empty, but listening. To the people of Naples, the Bellinis were quiet, devout, and a little strange. But in a city where saints' bones wept blood and statues turned their heads, strange was not uncommon, not until the strings began to move on their own. By all accounts, Lorenzo Bellini was a man of method and obsession. Records from the Guild of Artisans list him as a woodcarver and theatrical engineer, a rare title in that era, suggesting both craftsmanship and invention. He was not wealthy, but neither was he poor. His modest success came from the uniqueness of his puppets. Each figure bore hand-painted irises, glass teeth, and joints that could flex at the wrist and ankle, a precision unknown among his peers. He claimed his technique came from measuring motion as a heartbeat, a phrase that puzzled his contemporaries. He was born in 1791, the son of a carpenter and a midwife. His wife, Lucia, had died giving birth to Isabella in 1814, leaving him alone in the small apartment above the theatre. It is said that after Lucia's death, Lorenzo refused to remarry, convinced that devotion, once split, could never be made whole again. He poured that devotion into his craft and into the child she left behind. Those who visited the workshop described it as unnervingly quiet, save for the faint sound of wood being sanded and the occasional creak of strings tightening. Bellini's puppets became famous for their uncanny realism. They did not jerk or twitch like the others one might see in the bustling squares. They glided. When they raised a hand, it seemed to anticipate the next gesture, as if thought preceded movement. Scholars from northern Italy wrote briefly of his performances, calling them a wonder of artifice, nearly human. A few critics, however, accused him of deception, claiming he used hidden mechanisms or live actors behind the curtain. No one could ever prove it. It was during these years that Isabella began appearing on stage beside her father, not as a performer, but as an assistant, her small hands deftly untangling strings and repairing broken joints. She was pale, frail, but graceful. When the show ended, the audience often applauded her delicate bow, mistaking her stillness for stage discipline. Lorenzo's eyes always followed her, not with pride, but with an anxious tenderness, as if he feared that if he blinked, she would vanish. In a letter believed to be from Bellini to a friend named Enrico Falcone, found among the confiscated papers, he wrote, "The human body is but an instrument. The divine secret lies not in flesh, but in pattern. If motion is the language of the soul, then perhaps one may speak it into being." The letter is dated October 1827, just months before the first recorded mention of what locals would later call the Night of Moving Strings. Whatever Bellini meant by that phrase, it marked the beginning of a transformation, one that would blur the line between creation and creator and make even faith itself tremble. Isabella Bellini was a child seldom heard, but often seen. The few surviving accounts of her describe a girl of small stature, pale complexion, and eyes so dark they seemed to swallow light. She was said to move deliberately, without pause, as though her body were counting a rhythm the rest of us could not hear. In the register of the parish of Santa Maria del Porto, her name appears only 3 times. Once at birth, once during her first confession, and once in a note penned by Father Rinaldi that reads simply, "Sickly disposition, to be prayed for." After that, there is silence. Witnesses from neighboring apartments recalled that she rarely ventured outdoors. Her father, Lorenzo, would bring her down to the theatre only after sunset, when the streets had emptied and the smell of the sea carried through the alleyways. From the open door, A dim light could sometimes be seen flickering against the walls inside, shadows of marionettes dancing slowly across the plaster, as if performing to no audience at all. And in the midst of that faint, rhythmic motion, a child's shape would pass through the glow, moving with a grace that seemed rehearsed yet entirely her own. One of the few first-hand observations of Isabella comes from a letter written by Rosa Giacometti, the widow who lived across the courtyard. She wrote, "The little girl would sit beside her father and lift her arms exactly as the puppet did, as though mirroring it. When he turned the strings, she turned her wrists. When he let it fall, her head bowed too. It was as if she were the reflection and the wooden thing, the real child." In 1828, such stories were not uncommon among the working poor, who often mingled faith, folklore, and fear into a single worldview. Still, even the most superstitious grew uneasy. Some whispered that Isabella had been born without a soul, and that Lorenzo, in his grief for his dead wife, had given her one not meant for her. Others claimed he had bound her to his puppets through ritual, though no one could say what kind. There are rumors, unconfirmed but often repeated, that the girl's condition worsened after the Feast of St. Gennaro that year. A street performer reported seeing her faint in the theatre doorway, while her father shouted, not for a doctor, but for scissors. When questioned later, he explained only that the strings had tangled. It is unclear whether Isabella was ever truly ill or if something else was unravelling within the house of Bellini. What is certain is that by late autumn she no longer appeared in public. The performances continued for a time, but witnesses noticed a difference in the movements of the puppets. They no longer mimicked life, they embodied it. The evening of December the 14th, 1828, was unusually cold for Naples. The sea mist rolled thick through Via del Porto, blurring the gas lamps into soft halos of gold. That night, Teatro Bellini di Marionette opened its doors to a full house. Merchants, dock workers, and a few curious scholars among them. The performance had been announced simply as Il cuore che muove, the heart that moves. No one knew what to expect. The show began like any other. The curtain rose to reveal a small wooden table, a single candle, and a marionette of a young girl seated upon a chair. The puppet's craftsmanship was breathtaking. Strands of black silk for hair, ivory-painted hands, and joints that moved so fluidly they seemed to breathe. Behind it stood Lorenzo Bellini, visible to the audience, his eyes fixed not on them, but on the puppet. He lifted his hand, and the puppet mirrored him with perfect synchronization. Then, slowly, his arm lowered, but the puppet's arm did not. It stayed aloft, trembling faintly, before moving again, this time without the twitch of a guiding string. A murmur rippled through the audience. Bellini said nothing. The candle flickered once, twice, and the puppet began to stand. No mechanism could be seen. The strings hung slack, yet the figure rose, swayed slightly, and turned its head toward the spectators. Its eyes, two small glass beads, reflected the light in a way that made them seem wet. Someone in the back row gasped. Another began to cross himself. When the curtain finally fell, a strange silence gripped the room. It was not applause that followed, but confusion. Some swore it was a trick of mirrors, others whispered that the devil himself had touched the strings. Bellini stepped forward only once to bow, his face expressionless, his hands trembling faintly as he clasped them together. A short notice appeared the next day in the Giornale di Napoli, a spectacle of great craft and wonder, yet ill-suited for the faint-hearted. Signor Bellini's latest display transcends mere artistry, though by what means we cannot say. 2 nights later, a second performance was scheduled. It never took place. The theatre was found locked, and those who knocked claimed to hear movement inside, a sound like a wooden foot dragging softly across the floor. That week, several patrons reported falling ill with feverish dreams. One described waking in the dark, unable to move, while something small and jointed climbed slowly onto his chest. No police record survives from that winter, though a note found years later in a constable's log reads, Visited Via del Porto, Bellini's theatre. Lights within though doors barred. Possible disturbance. No response. After that night, the phrase, "the heart that moves," vanished from advertisements, but its echo remained. A whisper in Naples that something in that theatre had moved without the will of man. In January of 1829, roughly a month after the final performance of Il cuore che muove, a man named Dr. Vittore Camardi recorded an unusual visit in his personal correspondence. Camardi was a respected anatomist at the University of Naples, known for his work on muscular degeneration and the mechanics of involuntary movement. His letters, preserved in the Accademia di Scienze Mediche, include a brief but chilling note. Visited artisan Bellini at the request of the parish to examine a mechanical anomaly. The device imitates reflex, but the source of motion is unclear. Camardi's visit appears to have been prompted by church officials who had grown concerned over reports of unnatural phenomena in the puppet theatre. The performance had provoked debate in theological circles. If the puppets truly moved without strings, then Bellini had either discovered a scientific marvel or committed blasphemy. The church preferred to decide which. According to Camardi's surviving papers, he found Bellini's workshop in disarray. Wood shavings covered the floor like fallen leaves, he wrote, and everywhere the smell of resin and wax mixed faintly with something like vinegar. In the center of the room stood a small wooden figure, half-finished, its torso split open to reveal an intricate system of pulleys and fine copper threads. Bellini watched silently as the doctor examined it. When asked about the purpose of the construction, Bellini replied only, "To understand the moment before movement." The doctor, perhaps sensing the man's fragility, pressed further. Bellini is said to have gestured toward a sketch pinned to the wall, a human heart, detailed with both anatomical precision and strange symbols drawn around it. "Everything that lives," he murmured, "beats to a rhythm. The body follows that rhythm long after the soul forgets it." Camardi's tone in his later letter to the Pari is skeptical, even dismissive. He wrote, "Bellini's talent in mechanics is remarkable, but his mind is evidently strained. He speaks of pulse as language, and claims that motion itself can recall the departed. I suspect grief has led him into delusion." The letter concludes with a suggestion that the church avoid further involvement, lest the artisan's reputation cast superstition upon the city. Yet curiously, among the doctor's papers lies a second note, unsigned, undated, and found folded within the same envelope. "The puppet moved when I turned away. There was no draught. I saw it in the reflection of a jar. The hand lifted once, as if it wished to greet me. I left without returning." That was the last correspondence Camardi ever wrote concerning Lorenzo Bellini. Within a month, the anatomist resigned his post at the university and withdrew from public life. No record survives of what became of him, only the lingering suspicion that, for one brief moment, science had stared too closely at something that refused to remain still. By the spring of 1829, the doors of Teatro Bellini remained closed. Dust gathered on the red curtains, and no music echoed from its stage. The neighbors began to whisper that Lorenzo had fallen ill, though no doctor was seen entering his home. Others claimed it was the daughter, Isabella, whose pale form had not been glimpsed for many months. The window shutters above the theatre, once left open to catch the sea air, were now sealed tight. A single account survives from a delivery boy named Matteo Ricci, who later testified in a parish inquiry. He claimed to have brought groceries to the Bellini home, and upon hearing no response, pushed open the door to find the puppeteer kneeling beside a bed. The girl lay motionless beneath a thin linen sheet. Her eyes were open, Matteo told the priest, but she was not seeing. The father was whispering her name again and again, while turning a spool of thread in his hand. After that day, no one saw Isabella alive again. No funeral was held, no notice posted. The parish priest, Father Rinaldi, recorded a single line in his ledger. The child Isabella Bellini, withdrawn from earthly care. What precisely that meant, he did not explain. From that point onward, the reports about the puppeteer became increasingly unsettling. Residents of Via del Porto complained of noises from the theatre late at night, rhythmic creaks, the sound of strings tightening, and a faint knocking that seemed to answer itself. One neighbour wrote anonymously to the local authorities. He speaks to her as if she still breathes. I have heard a small voice reply, though the tone was wrong, too light, too measured, like wind caught in hollow wood. Among the confiscated notes found in the archives is a half-burned page written in Bellini's unmistakable hand. The body is gone, but her rhythm remains. I can still feel it when I pull the thread. It resists. It remembers. By early summer, a sour smell began to drift from the theatre's walls. When the landlord demanded entry, Lorenzo reportedly barred the door and shouted that he was in rehearsal. The man never pressed further. In a neighborhood accustomed to loss, few wished to question grief that sounded like madness. The last documented sign of life in the Bellini home came from a candle spotted burning in the upstairs window on June 6, 1829, its flame steady despite the wind off the sea. By dawn, it was gone. A parish notice dated 2 days later states that Teatro Bellini is hereby suspended until further clerical review due to complaints of indecency and unnatural conduct. The review was never completed. By midsummer of 1829, the once bustling courtyard of Via del Porto had fallen silent. The scent of salt and resin no longer drifted from the theatre. Instead, a faint, metallic odour, like rusted iron, seemed to cling to the air whenever the wind blew from the sea. The locals spoke in lowered voices of noises coming from the Bellini residence, sounds that began at dusk and lasted until the first light of morning. One neighbour, Paolo Corsi, whose testimony was later recorded in an unsigned police memorandum, claimed that each night he heard the scrape of chairs dragging across the floor above his shop. It was as if someone were rehearsing steps, he wrote, but too many feet for one man. Sometimes they stopped, and you could hear only breathing. Not a person's breath. Something shorter, sharper, like air squeezed through wood. The constable sent to investigate reported no crime. His written note reads simply, "No signs of habitation. Door bolted from inside. Noise ceased upon approach." He left without further comment. By August, the city's humidity turned oppressive, and the stench from the theatre worsened. A local washerwoman swore she saw candlelight flickering through the cracks of the shutters, yet no one entered or left the building. Some nights, faint music echoed through the alleyway. Not the lively melodies of puppet shows, but a slow, halting rhythm, like strings being plucked in sorrow. From this period comes one of the most disturbing artifacts in the Bellini archive, a sheet of parchment stained with something dark, possibly oil or blood, covered in jagged handwriting. The lines are fragmented, as though written in haste. If the hand moves without command, it remembers its purpose. The strings answer her weight. I have learned to keep still and let her lead. Scholars who examined the document a century later noted that the handwriting shifts halfway. Down the page, the last few lines more delicate, the ink fading as if written by a smaller hand. The final phrase trails off mid-sentence. I can feel her eyes when I sleep. Rumours spread quickly among the residents that the puppeteer was attempting to bring his daughter back through his art. Some claimed to hear a girl's laughter inside the boarded theatre, followed by the unmistakable sound of strings tightening. Others avoided the alley altogether. One anonymous report sent to the parish concluded with the words, "If he has found a way to make the dead move, then the devil has found his apprentice." By the first week of September, the noises ceased altogether. The house remained shuttered, its interior hidden from the world, and though no one entered, Several swore that the shadows behind the windows had changed position each night, as if something inside was still learning how to stand. On the evening of October 21st, 1829, Teatro Bellini reopened its doors for the first time in nearly 10 months. No public announcement was made, no posters were printed. Yet word spread quickly through the lower quarters that the puppeteer had returned, and that he intended to perform a requiem in motion. By dusk, a small crowd gathered outside the theatre, drawn by curiosity or fear, unsure which. Inside, candles flickered against the peeling plaster walls. The air was thick with the scent of oil and old wood. Those who later testified described the atmosphere as hushed, reverent, and wrong, like a church where no one believes anymore. The stage curtain was already raised. At its centre stood a single marionette, a girl with black silk hair and a white linen dress. Her glass eyes reflected the light like 2 drops of water. Lorenzo Bellini appeared before the audience, his face pale and gaunt. He bowed once, but said nothing. Those who knew him remarked that his hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the strain of holding them still. Without introduction or music, he lifted the control bar, and the puppet began to move. It was not the jerking motion of a stage toy. The movement was deliberate, measured, human. She walked the length of the stage, paused, and turned her head toward the audience. The joints did not creak. The strings remained slack. Some said they saw Bellini's mouth moving, whispering, perhaps praying, while the puppet raised one arm and pointed to the balcony above. A woman screamed when she realized the figure on the stage bore Isabella's likeness exactly. Same dark hair, same frail posture, the same small birthmark painted beneath the left eye. Bellini lowered his head, and the marionette began to dance. The rhythm was slow, almost mournful. It turned, lifted its arms, and in a gesture that seemed too fluid to be mechanical, reached to ward its master. The puppeteer dropped the crossbar, yet the figure continued to move. Panic rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted that the devil was inside it. Another man overturned a chair. Witnesses claimed the puppet tilted its head toward the audience, its mouth opening ever so slightly as though to speak. But no sound emerged. The curtain fell. When the constable arrived hours later, the theatre was dark and empty. The door was locked from within. On the stage they found only the puppet, seated neatly in a child's chair, one hand resting across its lap, the other clutching a red silk ribbon. Lorenzo Bellini was never seen again. By morning, word had spread across Naples. The puppeteer had given his soul to the strings. The official record of the Bellini case begins with the report of Inspector Marco Conti, dated October 24, 1829, 3 days after the final performance. The document, preserved in fragmentary form, was recovered from the Naples Municipal Archive and bears the notation, "Filed under disturbance of peace, unresolved." Conti's handwriting is neat, disciplined, and entirely devoid of drama, yet his observations betray a man unsettled by what he found. Upon entry to the premises, he writes, "I noted the presence of wax residue upon the floors, as if numerous candles had been lit and extinguished in haste. The air within was thick, unmoving, carrying the odor of resin and what I would describe as decay. No individual was found on site. The theatre door had been bolted from the inside. The puppet, which witnesses identified as the likeness of Isabella Bellini, was discovered at the center of the stage, seated upright upon a wooden chair." Conti continues, "The marionette is of extraordinary workmanship, jointed beyond the ordinary degree. Of particular note, the strings remain attached though cut near the handles, suggesting deliberate severance." He also notes finding several small footprints on the stage boards, far lighter than adult weight, impressions consistent with a child's bare feet. Behind the curtain, the inspector discovered a makeshift table covered in sketches and tools. Among them were 3 peculiar items: a glass vial containing dried residue, a small hammer engraved with the letter I, and a folded piece of parchment labelled Motus Secundus. The document contained what appeared to be a sequence of rhythmic marks, almost musical notation, accompanied by the words, "If followed precisely, the hand will recall the heart." Conti's report makes no mention of Lorenzo's whereabouts. Neighbours testified they had not seen him leave, nor had they heard struggle or commotion. The inspector searched the apartment above the theatre and found the bed unslept in, the wash basin dry, and a half-eaten loaf of bread on the table. Only one personal object appeared freshly handled, a small wooden spool, wound tightly with crimson thread. In his closing paragraph, Conti writes, "It is my conclusion that Bellini has absconded or met an unnatural fate of his own making. The puppet shall be taken into temporary custody pending church review, as citizens have voiced concern regarding its properties." 2 days later, the marionette was delivered to the custody of Father Rinaldi at Santa Maria del Porto. The inspector signed the transfer record and noted that the object's head turned slightly during handling, attributing the motion to imbalance or wind. Conti's report ends there. A single addendum, unsigned and written in a different hand, was appended to the file years later. No trace of Bellini ever found. Child's voice reported in parish storage. Recommend burial of object. The parish of Santa Maria del Porto accepted the custody of the marionette on October 26, 1829, under the authority of Father Donato Rinaldi, parish rector and noted scholar of moral theology. The transfer was recorded in the parish ledger as a recovered theatrical object of indecent and heretical character. The church's stated intention was to examine the artifact for evidence of occult manipulation before ordering its destruction. Yet destruction never came. Father Rinaldi's correspondence with the diocesan office survives only in fragments. One letter dated November 1st reads, "The object is here and remains undisturbed. I am reluctant to proceed until further consultation, for its nature defies immediate judgment. Though it is wood and cord, it seems to observe. The younger clerics will not enter the storage room at night." Witness accounts from within the parish describe a growing discomfort among the staff. The sexton, Giuseppe Moro, told investigators that he often heard movement from the locked storage chamber where the puppet was kept. "It was a soft shifting sound," he said, "as though someone were adjusting position upon a chair." When questioned further, he added, "The strings were always wound tighter in the morning." Father Rinaldi, perhaps sensing hysteria, attempted to downplay the rumours in his sermons, yet his writings suggest a private struggle between reason and fear. In one passage of his journal, discovered after his death, he wrote, "The figure unsettles me. Each morning I find it facing a different direction upon the shelf. At times I wonder whether the movement is mine, some unconscious adjustment, yet I cannot recall ever touching it." He requested assistance from the diocesan archivist, Monsignor Gallo, who advised a simple benediction and storage under cloth until proper disposal could be arranged. That benediction took place on Noves. Ember the 9th, attended by 2 witnesses. What occurred during the ritual is unclear, but both witnesses later resigned their posts. One, in a statement written years later, claimed, "During the prayer, I heard something creak behind the father's words, not in the timber, but in the breath. The puppet's head inclined slightly forward, and its left hand rose as if in acknowledgement." Following that event, Father Rinaldi ordered the chamber sealed and the object bound with rosary chains. The entry in the parish book concludes curtly, "Object secured. Further examination forbidden." Yet despite the formal closure, rumours continued to spread. Parish visitors reported hearing faint tapping from the walls during confession, rhythmic and deliberate. One woman swore the sound matched the pace of her own heartbeat. By the end of that winter, attendance at Santa Maria del Porto had halved. The parish's silence became its only defence, and the church quietly chose denial over explanation. For the remainder of 1829, the marionette remained locked in the lower vestry chamber of Santa Maria del Porto, an unused room beneath the rectory that had once stored reliquaries and broken statuary. The priests referred to it, half-jokingly, as the puppet crypt. No official access was granted after Father Rinaldi's order to seal the door, but human curiosity, as always, proved stronger than obedience. In early December, the sexton Giuseppe Moro confessed to entering the chamber against orders. His testimony was later found among the diocesan archives, written in a shaky hand. "I wished to prove to the others that fear had no place here. The air was still and heavy, smelling of varnish and wax. The figure sat upon a wooden stool, wrapped in cloth. I uncovered it to show it was only wood, but when the cloth fell, its head turned slightly, as if loosened by gravity. Yet there was no draught." Moro described attempting to lift the puppet but dropping it immediately. He claimed that the strings, though severed, had coiled around his wrist, as if with purpose. A small cut appeared there, which he later showed to the priest. The wound was narrow, symmetrical, and deep enough to leave a scar that never healed cleanly. 2 days later, Moro was found unconscious near the altar, his pulse rapid and irregular. Witnesses reported that before collapsing, he had been mumbling something under his breath, a series of numbers and pauses. When pressed later, he said he had been counting the rhythm that came from beneath the floorboards. After that incident, the parish decided to move the object. Records indicate that on December 17th, 2 clerics transported the marionette to the ossuary beneath the adjoining chapel. The intent was to place it among old tomb markers, away from contact and temptation. However, a note appended to the relocation entry in Father Rinaldi's handwriting adds, "Do not touch the strings. They seem to move with the drafts of no wind." What occurred afterward remains uncertain, but in January 1830, an inventory report lists an unexplained injury. One of the assisting clerics suffered burns to his palms, as though from hot wire. Another refused to speak altogether, resigning his position and leaving Naples. The puppet was eventually catalogued under a new label, Object 47A, Marionetta di Provenienza Sconosciuta. Its origin was deliberately obscured. By mid-year, the Bellini name no longer appeared in any parish record. The church had buried not only the artifact, but the story itself, entombed beneath silence, sealed beneath faith. Yet beneath that faith, something had begun to stir. The few who entered the ossuary in the years that followed claimed they sometimes heard soft creaking in the dark, as though wood remembered how to move. In the early hours of February the 9th, 1830, a fire broke out along Via del Porto, consuming several adjoining buildings before it reached what remained of Teatro Bellini. The cause was never determined. The parish records list the event under conflagration of unknown origin, no casualties recorded. Yet witnesses gave differing accounts, and all of them mentioned the same strange detail. The flames began in a place that had been abandoned for months. According to the statement of Alessandro Corti, a fisherman who lived opposite the theatre, the blaze erupted shortly after midnight. "It began with light, not smoke," he wrote, "a pulse of red from inside the shutters, like a lantern swinging behind the glass." The doors then burst open, releasing a rush of heat so fierce that nearby windows shattered. Corti swore he saw shapes moving within the fire, not human, but smaller, jointed, jerking with a kind of rhythm, as though strings invisible still guided them through the smoke. When the fire brigade arrived, the structure had already collapsed inward. The floorboards were reduced to black ash, the rafters glowing like coals. No human remains were recovered. The firefighters did, however, note the discovery of several metallic fragments among the debris, thin, curved wires, fused at the ends as though melted together. An unsigned report, preserved in the municipal archive, contains one additional detail omitted from the official account. Found beneath western wall, one marionette, unburned though blackened by soot, object removed by parish authority, all others destroyed. That object would later be identified as Object 47A, the same figure that had already been transferred to church custody months prior. How it returned to the theatre remains unexplained. Some historians suggest that Bellini, if alive, had broken into the parish crypt to reclaim it. Others believe that the church, unable to destroy it, returned it to its maker under cover of night, preferring to let fire finish what faith could not. Rumours spread swiftly through Naples that week. Children whispered of the Girl of Ash, a puppet who walked through fire unharmed. Adults spoke of a curse that followed the Bellini name, that any who tried to erase him would lose what he had stolen from death itself. The ruins of the theatre smouldered for 3 days. When the ashes cooled, the foundation stones were pulled apart and sold for reuse in nearby construction. To this day, no plaque or marker identifies the site. But workers who laid those stones in new walls claimed they sometimes heard faint tapping within them, like tiny fingers beating in rhythm. And though no one could prove it, the parish ledger from that spring bears one additional note in the margin, written in faded ink. The object was not destroyed. In 1901, more than 70 years after the fire, the name Bellini returned to official notice for the first time. It surfaced not in the theatre records nor the police ledgers, but in the inventory of a historian, Professor Giovanni Santori, archivist of the Basilica di San Domenico Maggiore. His task had been routine, to catalogue a shipment of unclaimed ecclesiastical documents transferred from minor parishes in the southern provinces. Among these, he discovered a sealed package marked only with a small black cross and the initials SMP, presumed to stand for Santa Maria del Porto. The wrapping was brittle, the wax seal fractured by time. Inside lay a collection of papers, 17 sheets in total, some written in Latin, others in the rough flowing Italian of the early 19th century. Several bore the same watermark, a theatre emblem, 2 masks entwined by a ribbon. The ink had faded, yet one phrase appeared repeatedly across the margins: De motu cordis mortuae. Santori, a careful man by nature, noted in his personal diary that the handwriting varied, suggesting multiple authors. The earliest sheets, he wrote, concern a craftsman named Lorenzo Bellini and the alleged animation of a lifeless figure. The later documents pertain to ecclesiastical confinement of said figure under charges of superstition and heresy. He also recorded the presence of what he called chemical residue upon the parchment, possibly oil, possibly blood. Intrigued, Santori brought the documents to his private study for translation. He would later write to a colleague in Florence, "I have encountered an account that straddles the line between theology and madness. The author speaks of transferring rhythm from the living to the inanimate, of a daughter who moves when her heart has ceased. It is written with such precision that it cannot be dismissed as mere fable." His fascination soon turned to alarm. In his second diary entry, dated April the 19th, Santori describes hearing a sound while reading late into the night. A light tapping, 3 beats repeated twice, coming from the cabinet where the papers were stored. He blamed fatigue, yet admitted the rhythm matched the sequence notations found in the text. 2 weeks later, Santori requested that the church reclaim the file. He labelled it unsuitable for public access and sealed it once more with red wax. His final remark, added in the inventory ledger, reads, "The Bellini case is to remain unpublished. The artifact referenced herein should not be sought. Motion has memory." No further writings from Santori exist beyond that point. He retired from his post later that same year and died quietly in his sleep. His death certificate cites natural causes, though the attending physician noted an unusual contortion of the hands, the fingers drawn inward, as though grasping an invisible thread. Among the 17 documents catalogued by Professor Santori, one stood apart. It was smaller than the rest, folded 3 times and sealed with a trace of black wax. Unlike the other sheets, it bore no ecclesiastical stamp or archival code. Its outer edge carried a single name, written in faded graphite: Isabella. Inside was a letter, written in a hand unmistakably belonging to Lorenzo Bellini. The ink had corroded the paper in places, and entire lines were lost to age, but enough survived to reconstruct its dreadful intent. It was addressed not to a person of authority, nor to a friend, but directly to his deceased daughter. Scholars later called it the untranslated letter, though several attempts were made to decipher its hybrid language, a mixture of Italian, Latin, and what one philologist described as the rhythm of a musical score. The opening lines read, "My little heart, the rhythm has not left you. It lingers in the hollows of my hands. The body forgets, but the pattern remembers. I have found a way to make the wood recall you, to let it finish what you began." As the letter progresses, Bellini's tone shifts from grief to method, outlining a process that blends devotion, anatomy, and lunacy. He speaks of matching heartbeat to pulse, of measuring breath with thread, and of a theory he calls sympathia motus, the sympathetic motion between creator and creation. Several passages refer to the glass cage, which some historians interpret as a reference to the puppet's torso, perhaps containing a mechanism or relic. Others believe it was metaphor, a heart imprisoned in memory. The most disturbing sentence, though fragmented, reads clearly, "When your eyes closed, mine forgot to blink. Now you are never still, and I am never awake." Toward the end, Bellini's script deteriorates into uneven lines, as though written by a shaking hand or dictated to someone else. The final phrase trails off mid-word. "If the rhythm is right, she will—" The last mark on the page is not ink, but a thin line of reddish-brown, as though drawn by a fingertip. When Professor Santori first encountered the letter in 1901, he sent a request to the University of Palermo's Department of Antiquities for translation. The envelope was returned unopened, accompanied by a brief note. "We do not study false resurrection." No certified translation was ever made. The original remains in the sealed Bellini file, its text officially designated inconclusive due to unstable linguistic form. But among Santori's personal notes, one line appears, written hastily in the margin beside his summary of the letter. "The words have cadence. When read aloud, the paper seems to tremble." The 16th document in the Bellini archive is a medical memorandum, unsigned but attributed by handwriting analysis to Dr. Vittore Camardi, the same anatomist who visited Bellini months before Isabella's disappearance. The paper is dated March 3, 1829, though it was evidently never filed through official channels. Its content was later described by archivists as confessional in nature, written in the careful tone of a man attempting to rationalize the irrational. The first line reads, "This report I compose for conscience, not for record." Camardi begins by recounting his prior encounter with Bellini, summarizing his impressions of the artisan's brilliance and instability. He admits that following their meeting, curiosity overcame propriety, and he sought the man out again. This time, not as a physician, but as a witness. The text continues, "He had written to me in great distress. His daughter, he said, was passing from this world, yet he claimed she need not remain absent. I believed him delirious, but the words haunted me." Camardi confesses that he visited the Bellini residence late one night and found the house lit by dozens of candles. Isabella's body lay upon a table, her face calm, her small hands folded over her chest. Around her were placed several marionettes, broken, dismantled, their limbs arranged in patterns like crude anatomical diagrams. "He worked not in grief," Camardi wrote, "but in focus. Each thread tied between her wrists and the puppet's joints as if measuring response. When the doctor protested, Bellini allegedly whispered, 'Do not speak, or you will interrupt her.'" Camardi's account becomes increasingly fragmented. He describes taking the father's arm and feeling the man's pulse quicken in rhythm with the faint twitching of the wooden limbs. "The movement was real," he insists. "Reflex cannot occur where nerve is absent. It was as though her pulse travelled through the thread." Terrified, he severed one of the cords and fled. The remainder of the memorandum reads like an admission of complicity. Camardi admits that he falsified Isabella's death certificate the next morning at Bellini's request, listing the cause as respiratory decline, and noting that the body had been released to the father for burial. He writes, "I feared scandal and sought to end the matter. Yet when I returned days later, he thanked me for the time I had given him, and I understood to my shame that he meant more than the paperwork." The final sentence is underlined twice. "I do not know what I witnessed, but I cannot silence the sound. That faint creaking, like a heartbeat learning to speak." Camardi disappeared from public record soon afterward. His license was never revoked nor renewed. The file ends there, unsigned, as if the hand that wrote it could not bring itself to finish. In the sealed portion of the Bellini file, there exists a manuscript bound in rough parchment and marked with a faded diocesan crest. It bears no author's name, only the title De Motu Cordis Mortuae, on the motion of the dead heart. Handwriting analysis suggests it was copied by a parish scribe sometime in 1831, long after the events in Naples had supposedly ended. The document is part treatise, part admonition, and part prayer. The opening page begins with a cautionary epigraph. "Let not man seek to imitate the rhythm of the Creator, for rhythm is life, and life once ceased must not be called again." The first section reads like an ecclesiastical investigation, outlining what the author calls the heretical theory of sympathetic motion. It describes reports from southern Italy concerning a craftsman who claimed to transfer the pulse of the departed into carved wood through continuous repetition of measured beats. The text names no individual, but the initials LB appear several times in the margins. Further pages grow darker. They detail what appears to be a ritual of reconstruction. Threads arranged to mimic veins, wax warmed to retain memory of heat, and the recitation of a precise rhythm said to summon remembrance into vessel. One passage notes, "When the thread moves without the hand, withdraw thy gaze, for it has begun." Scholars who later reviewed the manuscript noted the strange mixture of scientific and theological language. It references both musculorum motus, the mechanics of muscle, and spiritus residuum, the residue of spirit. The writer seems torn between condemning the act and documenting its results. If such transference were true, he warns, then the soul is divisible, and sin may breathe through craft. Midway through the text, a marginal note written in another hand reads simply, "Bellini non mortuus." Bellini is not dead. The final pages are nearly illegible, charred at the edges as though scorched. What can be read seems to describe an experiment conducted under church supervision, involving the burned remnants of a marionette retrieved from the ruins of Via del Porto. The entry ends abruptly. The object emitted sound when touched by flame. 3 beats, then silence. After that, the text breaks into prayer. "Lord, bind the hands of the Maker that moves against thee. Let no rhythm answer his name." The Church never acknowledged the existence of De Motu Cordis Mortuae. It was resealed in 1832 and listed under Doctrinal Errors, Restricted Access. Only 3 officials were permitted to view it thereafter. All 3 died within the same decade. The manuscript has never been photographed. Its pages remain under lock in the Vatican archives, catalogued without subject heading, between volumes on miracles and deceit. By the mid-19th century, the story of Lorenzo Bellini had faded from the records of Naples, but not from its streets. Official documents were buried, names erased, and the Church denied all knowledge of the affair. Yet among fishermen, street performers, and market vendors, the tale endured, reshaped, retold, and whispered like a curse. They called it Il Bosco che Sussurra, the Whispering Wood. The name did not refer to a forest, but to a small cluster of ruined buildings near the waterfront where the old theatre had once stood. Children dared one another to enter the rubble at dusk, claiming that if you pressed your ear to the remaining stones, you could hear the faint creak of strings. The wood remembers, they said, because it was taught to. In 1847, a traveller from Florence, recorded hearing such tales in his diary. The locals speak of a house that hums at night, of small footsteps, of a shadow that bends without wind. They warn that if you follow the sound, you will find not music, but something counting. He dismissed the story as superstition. Yet 2 pages later, he notes waking at dawn to what he described as a rhythm behind the walls of my lodging, 3 beats, repeated twice. By 1860, the legend had become a kind of folk morality. Parents warned disobedient children that La Figlia del Burattinaio, the puppeteer's daughter, would visit them if they lied or stayed out past dark. The apparition, they said, moved without sound until it was beside you, then whispered your own name in a wooden voice. Some claimed she sought to reclaim her strings. Others believed she wandered, unfinished, searching for her father's hands. Even after the area was rebuilt, strange incidents persisted. During the restoration of nearby housing in 1878, workers unearthed fragments of painted wood beneath the foundation, a face, a wrist joint, and what appeared to be a small glass eye. The items were sent to the Museo di San Martino, where they were briefly displayed under the label Unidentified Automaton Pieces, circa early 19th century. They vanished from the collection within the year. A century later, elderly residents of the quarter still refused to pass the spot after nightfall. One woman, interviewed in 1952, said she had lived beside the ruin her entire life and still heard tapping from her wall some evenings. When asked to describe it, she tapped the table 3 times, paused, and tapped twice more. No one has lived in that building since. The legend endured not because people remembered Lorenzo Bellini, but because they could not forget the sound. In 1968, nearly 140 years after the Bellini incident, a young historian named Dr. Vittorio Manca from the University of Turin undertook what he called a reconstruction of the Bellini phenomenon. His goal was to separate myth from verifiable record, a task that at first seemed merely academic. Manca was not a superstitious man. He specialized in the sociology of rumor, and Naples, with its centuries of miraculous legends, offered fertile ground for such a study. He began by tracing the earliest known documents connected to the case, the Conti Report, the Rinaldi Ledger, and a surviving fragment of De Motu Cordis Mortuae. The church denied his requests for access, but Manca managed to obtain microfilm copies of select pages through private channels. In his notes, preserved by his family after his death, he wrote, "The language is neither purely theological nor mechanical. It reads as if someone tried to measure faith." Over the next 2 years, he interviewed dozens of locals, particularly the elderly residents of the old port district. Many dismissed the legend as children's nonsense, yet a few offered details too specific to ignore. One man recalled his grandfather warning him that the puppet girl lives in the museum's basement, while another claimed to have seen the face of a child carved in ash during post-war reconstruction. Manca's research culminated in a paper titled Rhythm and Resurrection, The Bellini Case and the Limits of Mechanistic Faith. Though never officially published, a copy survives in the archives of the university. In it, he proposed that Bellini's work represented an early and misguided exploration of kinetic empathy, the idea that human beings project their consciousness onto moving forms. What terrified the witnesses, he argued, was not that the puppet moved, but that they recognized themselves in its motion. Yet, privately, his notes betray a different tone. In an entry dated June 3, 1970, he describes visiting Naples and locating the presumed site of the old theatre. "The air feels wrong," he wrote. "The workers speak of strange ticking sounds under the floor. At night, I dream of a small figure tracing the air with invisible lines, as though searching for rhythm." His final note, written a week before his return to Turin, reads simply, "The pattern persists. The city still hums." Dr. Vittorio Manca died in 1973 of what was officially listed as a cardiac event, while giving a lecture on the physiology of movement. Witnesses described his final moments as uncanny. His fingers twitched in precise intervals, tapping against the podium, 3 beats, pause, 2, until his hand went still. The artifact known as Object 47. A first appears in the Museo di San Martino's internal catalogue, dated March 12, 1893, decades before Dr. Manca's research revived the Bellini story. Its entry is concise. Marionette, female, composition wood and pigment, origin uncertain, 32 centimeters in height. Eyes of glass. Condition, intact. No curator's initials accompany the description, and its provenance field simply reads, Ecclesiastical Transfer, Naples Diocese. For years, the object sat unnoticed in the museum's lower collection room, a storage space reserved for damaged devotional figures and minor folk artifacts. It drew little attention until 1958, when an assistant restorer, Luciano Ferri, submitted an irregularity report concerning the puppet. His written statement remains preserved in the archive. While photographing inventory pieces, noted that Object 47A appeared in differing positions across frames. Possible movement due to table vibration or air current. Upon later examination, object had shifted 2 centimeters forward despite sealed enclosure. Ferry's supervisor dismissed the claim, attributing it to a cataloguing error. Nevertheless, the incident was logged, and new photographs were taken, 10 in total, under controlled lighting. When compared, subtle differences are visible even to the modern eye. The tilt of the head, the angle of the left wrist, the faint displacement of the ribbon coiled around one hand. In 1972, the museum underwent reorganization, and Object 47A was transferred to the Collezione Meccanica e Popolare, a small wing dedicated to automata and folk engineering. A short, descriptive label was affixed beside it. 19th century Neapolitan marionette, rumored association with Lorenzo Bellini, unverified. Visitors seldom lingered before it. Those who did remarked upon its uncanny realism, the slight sheen of its skin, the faint depression around the gito, lass eyes as if the wood beneath had softened with age. A memorandum from 1975, written by the night security officer Paolo Girardi, records an unusual occurrence. During power outage, corridor sensors indicated motion from display case 6. Upon restoration of power, found nothing disturbed except the puppet's position, now facing the door. I have sealed the case until further inspection. Photographs taken after the event confirm the alteration. The object, previously seated in profile, appears turned directly outward, the reflection of the camera flash captured in both glass eyes, like twin sparks. The museum closed that same year for renovation. When it reopened in 1977, Object 47A was absent from the floor plan. Its catalogue number was re-entered under Storage Unknown, with a handwritten note appended in blue ink, removed for restoration. No such restoration was ever documented. As of the latest inventory in 2001, the entry remains active. Location field blank. Condition unchanged. Yet each decade a new photograph is discovered, never officially filed, showing the same figure under different light in different rooms. The wood appears darker, the strings are missing, and in each image the puppet sits a little nearer to the lens. In 1973, the year of Dr. Vittorio Manca's death, a formal request was submitted to the Ministero dei Beni Culturali to reopen investigation into what was then called the Bellini Archive of Anomalous Artifacts. The petition bore Manca's signature, though dated only days before his collapse. In it he wrote, "There remains one surviving object whose documented history predates all confirmed theatrical automata. It is essential that Object 47A be examined in full before the legend consumes its truth." The ministry approved a preliminary inquiry under the supervision of Professor Carlo Benedetti, curator of mechanical antiquities at the University of Naples. His assignment was simple: locate the artifact, verify its provenance, and report whether it held any historical or mechanical significance. Benedetti's notes, later recovered from his estate, reveal growing frustration. The museum's administration denied that Object 47A was missing, yet could not produce it. The basement storage logs contradicted one another. Some listed the puppet under folk engineering, others under religious confiscations. One entry, dated March 17th, contained a strange annotation in pencil: "Return to diocese for evaluation." No record of transfer exists. Still, Benedetti persisted. He corresponded with surviving staff from the museum's 1950s inventory, including Luciano Ferri, the assistant who had first reported the shifting photographs. Ferri replied from a hospital in Genoa, where he was being treated for cardiac arrhythmia. His letter reads, "Professor, please do not seek the object. It is not missing. It follows." Benedetti initially dismissed the remark as delusion, until his own assistant, Marta Villani, reported disturbances in their temporary archive office, the sound of rhythmic tapping at irregular hours, papers displaced, and faint indentations on her desktop, as though fraud on narrow fingertips. On April the 2nd, she resigned without notice. In his final report, never submitted to the ministry but found among his private journals, Benedetti wrote, "The investigation has revealed no mechanism, no forgery, only a pattern. The pattern repeats across documents, years, and witnesses. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats. I have begun to notice it in my own pulse when at rest. Perhaps it is coincidence. Or perhaps this is what remains when motion outlives purpose." After 1973, all official reference to the Bellini archive ceased. The ministry closed its file under cultural inquiry, abandoned. Professor Benedetti retired 2 years later, citing health concerns. According to family accounts, he refused to have clocks in his home. He complained that their ticking never matched the world's time. He died in 1981, reportedly in his sleep. The attending physician noted nothing unusual, except that his right hand was clenched tightly, as though gripping a string. In 1975, a reel-to-reel recording labelled simply Bellini Test A was anonymously delivered to the Department of Acoustical Research at the University of Bologna. The accompanying note, typed in uneven alignment, read, "Recovered from the San Martino archives during reorganization. Possible artifact of mechanical origin. Evaluate for authenticity." The tape was approximately 12 minutes long. Its initial minutes contained only room noise, the faint hum of distant traffic, the scrape of a chair, a man's breath near the microphone. Then, at the 3-minute mark, a distinct creaking rhythm began. It was faint, deliberate, and unbroken. 3 beats, a pause, then 2. The pattern repeated, growing softer and more erratic, like something shifting its weight across a wooden floor. The lead technician, Gianni Morelli, documented the analysis in his report. Sound source consistent with organic motion on wooden surface. No evidence of gears, servos, or mechanical propulsion. Frequency irregular but recurring, with minor fluctuations in tempo consistent with fatigue. When playback was reversed, the pattern persisted. Identical cadence, identical spacing, suggesting that the sound had been produced in real time, not through post-recording manipulation. The department's magnetic spectrogram revealed an unexpected anomaly. Embedded beneath the primary waveform was a faint secondary hum, nearly subsonic, resembling a pulse. Morelli's team attempted to locate the tape's origin by tracing the real serial number. The manufacturer confirmed production in 1969, but had no record of distribution to Bologna. The reel's box bore a return address later found to correspond to the abandoned offices of the Museo di San Martino's mechanical wing, the same building where Object 47A had last been inventoried. Several copies of the recording were made for analysis. Within months, all be his, but one had been lost, one destroyed by fire, another misplaced during transport. Only the original remained, stored under controlled temperature in a locked drawer. 2 years later, the drawer was found open. The reel inside had partially unwound, the magnetic tape coiled loosely around the spindle as if tugged. When the remaining portion was played, the creaking was still present, but it no longer followed the earlier rhythm. The beats were uneven now, halting, and interspersed with a sound that resembled a faint wooden breath. At the very end of the tape, just before it cut to silence, a whisper could be heard. A man's voice, almost inaudible. "If you hear it, stop listening." The recording was reclassified as Anomalous Artifact, Category B. No researcher since has requested access. The tape was never broadcast, never released, never even publicly acknowledged. Yet fragments of it found their way into circulation, as they always do. In the late 1970s, a small circle of graduate researchers at the University of Turin began trading low-fidelity copies on cassette, labeling them Bellini's Heartbeat. Most dismissed it as a curiosity, an auditory illusion, the mind inventing presence where none existed. But a few listeners reported strange after-effects. One student claimed the rhythm would continue faintly in her ears hours after playback, like hearing footsteps behind me, always 3 and 2. Another described waking to the sound of his bed springs creaking in the same pattern, though the room was empty. The university eventually confiscated all known copies under a general noise disturbance order. The recording has not resurfaced since. The only surviving reel remains sealed in a temperature-controlled case in Bologna, catalogued under Experimental Acoustics, Restricted. The access form lists one authorized name, Dr. Vittorio Manca. The signature beside it, faint and smudged, is dated June 11th, 1973, 2 years before the tape's supposed arrival at the university. No explanation has ever been given for how his name appeared on a document created after his death. Some archivists have speculated that the form was falsified to lend the artifact legitimacy. Others believe that Manca's earlier research into kinetic empathy, the transfer of rhythm between observer and observed, somehow anticipated the tape's discovery. Whatever the case, the reel sits in its drawer still, quietly magnetic, its label half-faded but legible. Bellini, Test A. And every few years, when the inventory is rechecked, the archivists note the same anomaly. The reel has unwound itself again. I have studied the Bellini archive for over 4 years now. At first, it was merely an academic pursuit, a curiosity of history, a lesson in how myth persists when documentation falters. I told myself that I was immune to the seduction that destroyed others. But I have come to understand that studying the Bellini case is not an act of observation. It is participation. The story resists distance. It watches you back. Each document, each faded photograph, bears a rhythm, not only in language, but in spacing, in repetition, in the very strokes of the pen. The pattern is always the same. 3 beats, pause, 2. When I first noticed it, I dismissed it as coincidence. Now it appears everywhere, in the placement of punctuation, the timing of my own breathing, the flicker of the desk lamp. I began to dream of the theatre. I have never been to Naples, and yet I can describe the smell of its port at dusk, the damp salt and wood smoke. In these dreams I stand before a small stage lit by candles. A figure sits motionless at the centre. I never see its face, but I know it is waiting. When I wake, my hands are sore, as though they have been gripping something thin and tight through the night. 2 weeks ago, I recorded my observations on tape, hoping that hearing the words aloud might release the fixation. Instead, playback revealed something I cannot explain. Between my sentences, beneath my own voice, a faint creaking sound persists. Soft, deliberate, rhythmic. 3 beats. Pause. 2. I have since destroyed the tape. But the sound remains. I tell myself this is fatigue. Archivists have long warned that isolation breeds hallucination. Yet I no longer feel alone when I read Bellini's letters. The language draws closer. The ink seems darker, as if freshly written. Sometimes, when I turn a page, I imagine a second hand turning it with me. Yesterday, while cataloguing an old photograph from the museum's 1958 series, I noticed a reflection in the glass case, not of the photographer, but of another figure, half seen, standing behind the puppet. It was small, human-shaped but jointed, its arms bent at impossible angles. The curator insists the reflection is an artifact of the lens. I am not convinced. There are moments now when I think I understand Lorenzo Bellini, his grief, his defiance of stillness. Perhaps movement was his form of prayer. Perhaps he believed, as I am beginning to stop is to die, and that every heartbeat is merely a thread tugged by something we cannot name. If that is true, then I have already begun to move. The final entry in the Bellini Archive catalogue is dated October 12, 2001, though the handwriting differs from all previous curatorial notes. It is uneven, rushed, the pen pressed too deeply into the paper, the kind of writing one produces when their hand trembles. The line begins formally enough. Inventory update, Object 47A, status confirmed missing. Beneath it, however, several annotations appear, some crossed out, others written over one another, as though the author were struggling to keep pace with their own thoughts. The legible portions read, Case found open, no sign of forced entry. Dust layer undisturbed around display base. Glass intact. Object not within. Then, below that, smaller lines. Strings on floor, coiled, not broken, knotted together in center. And finally, catalogue photograph shows object seated in chair facing south. In reflection, second form visible behind camera, height approximately 32 centimeters. No further description follows. The page ends mid-sentence. What occurred in the hours surrounding this entry remains uncertain. Museum security logs show no alarm, no breach, no missing keys. Yet motion sensors in the sub-level corridor recorded intermittent movement between 2:14 and 2:17 a.m. Small, irregular shifts that ceased abruptly. When guards inspected the area later that morning, they reported finding a faint residue on the floor, a thin spiral of dust forming a pattern of concentric circles, as though something had spun lightly upon the spot. The entry was never filed electronically. It exists only on paper, found months later in the desk drawer of curator Livia Moretti, who vanished shortly after the discovery. Her apartment was left locked from the inside. No evidence of struggle was noted, but a neighbor reported hearing a soft thudding like a toy dropped repeatedly on the floor during the night she disappeared. Following her absence, the museum officially closed the Bellini file, citing loss of documentation due to administrative error. The surviving records were transferred to the Naples Historical Conservatory, where they remain sealed. In the final addendum attached to the folder, a different hand has written in neat archival script, "No further correspondence. Do not reopen file." But just below, pressed faintly into the paper as if traced by a fingernail, lies another line, one that appears only under angled light. Found again in storage. Different chair, facing the door. Since that note, no subsequent inventory of Object 47A has been conducted. Its number remains active in the catalogue system, unmarked, suspended between recorded and missing. And yet, each year, without fail, the log updates automatically with a single entry time-stamped just after midnight. It contains no description, no signature, only 2 words in the comment field. Still moving. There is a theory among archivists that certain stories do not end. They simply exhaust the will of those who try to contain them. The case of Lorenzo Bellini is one such story. Every attempt to close it, through fire, through faith, through bureaucracy, has only changed its shape. What began as a father's grief became legend, and legend, in time, became motion. Today, no verifiable trace of Bellini or his theatre remains. The buildings on Via del Porto have long since been rebuilt, the old parish absorbed into modern Naples. The church maintains no record of De Motu Cordis Mortuae. The museum denies ever holding Object 47A. And yet, from time to time, new fragments surface, a note misfiled, a photograph mislabeled, a pattern repeating where none should exist. 3 beats, pause, 2. The rhythm persists, quiet as breath, patient as memory. I have come to think of Bellini not as a man of sin, nor as a monster, but as a mirror. His error was not in invention, but in longing, the refusal to accept stillness. Every movement since creation is an echo of that first defiance, the wish to make what is gone move again. We call it art. We call it science. But in the end, it is the same prayer, whispered into different wood. When I began this research, I believed I was documenting a forgotten superstition. Now I suspect that every act of recording, every attempt to preserve what should fade, carries a trace of that same curse. The past is not dead. It waits for our attention, and when we look long enough, it looks back. If, while listening, you felt a faint stirring behind you, a creak of floorboards, a rhythm in your own pulse that did not match your heartbeat, consider it only coincidence. Most coincidences are. Most of them. And so ends the account of the puppeteer and his daughter, the tale that was never meant to be told, the motion that would not die. If you have listened this far, you are among the few who stay until the silence returns. Remember that silence is not absence, it is waiting. If you felt drawn into this forgotten history, take a moment to subscribe to the Macabre Record channel, where we unearth the forbidden stories time itself tried to bury. Leave a comment below and tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And should you hear a faint tapping as you do, 3 beats, a pause, 2, do not answer. For some strings, once pulled, never let go.